There's something I need to tell you before we get into the rest of this. I was there. Not as a guard, not as an officer, not as some kind of decorated witness who was supposed to be watching. I was there because I worked the documentation desk on Sublevel 4 of Helix 9, and my job was to stamp transit papers and drink cold Synthicaf, and try not to fall asleep between the hours of third shift start and morning rotation. So understand that when I tell you what happened that night, I'm not telling you something I read in a report. I'm telling you something I watched with my own 2 eyes from approximately 30 meters away, behind a piece of plexine paneling that I had pressed myself against because I genuinely did not know whether I was going to survive the next 10 minutes. What happened in Corridor 7D on Galactic Standard Cycle 744-188 changed the way a lot of species in the Outer Veil Corridor thought about human beings. It also made one very tired, very underpaid, very ordinary man named Milo Kastek completely impossible to explain. Let me back up. Helix 9 is not a glamorous station. I want to be clear about that right away, because sometimes when people hear Interstellar Diplomatic Transit Hub, they get a certain picture in their heads. Long gleaming corridors, soft lighting, species in formal dress gliding between secured chambers. And sure, there are parts of Helix 9 that look like that. The upper levels where the actual diplomats go have that kind of polish, warm amber light, quiet. Staff who speak 17 languages and smile at exactly the right frequency. Sublevel 4 is not that. Sublevel 4 is where the cargo comes through, where the maintenance crews run, where species who can't afford upper-level transit permits wait in long gray corridors for their connection berths to open. It smells like recycled atmosphere and machine lubricant, and whatever the Torathi food vendors are frying near Gate 12. The lights flicker about once every 3 hours because someone put in a repair request for the junction box, and it's been in queue for 8 months and nobody's gotten to it yet. It is, in short, a working station, a real station. The kind that keeps everything else running while the shiny parts of the galaxy get all the credit. I had been working the documentation desk on Sublevel 4 for going on 3 cycles. I knew the rhythms of the place the way you know the rhythms of anywhere you spend most of your waking hours. I knew which vendors closed early. I knew which corridors echoed strange when the atmospheric processors cycled through. I knew that the Grelin maintenance bots tended to cluster near Gate 7 on overnight shifts, because there was a power conduit there that put out warmth, and the bots had developed something that the engineers charitably called preference behavior, and the rest of us just called the bots like being warm. And I knew Milo Kastek. Not well, not the way you know a friend, but the way you know someone who exists in the same space as you for long enough that they become part of the landscape. He was one of 4 human sanitation workers assigned to Sublevel 4, and he had the overnight corridor rotation, the one that covered sections 6 through 9, which included Corridor 7D. He was not a remarkable-looking man. I want to emphasize this because I think it matters. He was medium height, medium build, maybe a little on the lean side. He had hair that was going gray at the temples and a face that had been weathered by enough years and enough long shifts that it had settled into a kind of permanent quiet expression. Not unhappy, not particularly content, just settled. Like a man who had made peace with the fact that the universe was large and complicated, and his job was to keep a specific corridor clean. He carried a mop. He carried a rolling cart with compartments for different cleaning solutions, and a biohazard container and extra rags. He wore the standard sanitation crew uniform, gray coveralls with the Helix 9 maintenance logo on the left shoulder, and he had a pair of old-style audio buds in his ears more often than not, connected to whatever he was listening to, which I had never asked about and he had never volunteered. On the night in question, he had been on shift for approximately 6 hours. He had already cleaned sections 6, 7A, 7B, 7C, and was beginning 7D when the Kelthari Honor Guard arrived. Now the Kelthari. If you know them, you know. If you don't, Let me paint the picture for one moment, because understanding what Milo Kastek walked into requires understanding exactly what the Kelthari are. The Kelthari Dominion is one of the oldest continuous military civilizations in the Outer Veil. They have been at war in one form or another for longer than most species have had written language. Not because they are cruel, they're not particularly, but because war for them is not a disruption. It is a state of being. Their entire social structure is built around it. Their art is about it. Their language has 14 words for different kinds of victory, and only 3 words for different kinds of peace. And one of those 3 translates roughly as temporary peace, and another translates as peace that is a trap, which I think tells you something. The Kelthari are tall, averaging about 2.4 standard meters. They have 4 limbs in the conventional sense, but a secondary set of upper appendages, shorter, more articulated, that are used exclusively for close combat and handling weapons. Their natural exoskeletal plating covers the back, shoulders, and cranium, and it is dense enough to stop conventional ballistic rounds. Their eyes are compound. They can perceive infrared and ultraviolet. They have pressure-sensitive hearing that works across a range no human auditory system can match. They are, by essentially every measurable metric, formidable. The 12 individuals who arrived on sublevel 4 of Helix 9 that night were not ordinary Kelthari soldiers. They were members of the Kelthari Honor Guard, the Vithraken, in their own language, which translates to something like, those who walk in the space between the weapon and the wound. The Honor Guard is an elite unit. Selection begins in early childhood and involves a process of training that spans decades. By the time a Kelthari warrior reaches Honor Guard status, they have been fighting, training, studying combat, and being shaped for it for longer than most humans have been alive. These 12 had been assigned to escort a Kelthari diplomatic dignitary, High Commander Sithrak Vaughn, through Helix 9 on his way to peace negotiations in the Upper Veil. The negotiations were sensitive. The security protocols were extensive. The Honor Guard had been briefed on every corridor, every access point, every potential threat vector on the route. What they had not been briefed on was Milo Kastek, which, in retrospect, was the mistake. I need to tell you how it started, because the start is strange in a way that matters. Third shift had been quiet. That's not unusual for overnight on sublevel 4. Most of the transit traffic moves through during standard daylight cycles, and by the time third shift rolls around, the corridors have thinned out. A few maintenance workers. The overnight documentation staff, which was me and a young Torathi named Belvek who spent most of his shift studying for something, and would occasionally show me whatever he was reading without any context or explanation, which I had come to accept as just his way. The Kelthari delegation came through a service entrance. That's the first unusual thing. Normally, dignitary escorts use the upper-level secure corridors. That's what they exist for. But apparently there had been some kind of concern about the upper-level route. Something flagged in the security sweep, and the decision had been made to reroute through sublevel 4. Through 7D specifically, because 7D connects to a maintenance lift that has a direct line to the upper docking section, bypassing 3 public access areas. Nobody told me. Nobody told Belvek. Nobody told the Grelin bots near Gate 7. And nobody, absolutely nobody, told Milo Kastek. So when 12 Kelthari Honor Guards in full ceremonial tactical armor came around the corner of Corridor 7D, what they found was a human man in gray coveralls pushing a mop across the floor, audio buds in his ears, apparently listening to something that made him nod his head occasionally in a slow, rhythmic way. He had his back to them. The floor was wet. There was a yellow caution indicator he had placed at the near end of the corridor, one of those simple fold-out signs that says caution, wet surface in 6 languages, because maintenance regulations require it. He had positioned it correctly. He was working systematically from the far wall toward the center, the way trained sanitation workers do. He didn't know they were there. Here is what I saw from the documentation desk, through the plexine wall that separates my work area from the 7D corridor. The plexine is translucent. You can see shapes and movement through it, but not fine detail. I had been half awake, doing the last round of transit paper processing for the shift, when I became aware of a quality of presence on the other side of the wall that was different from the usual foot traffic. Different in the way that a thunderstorm is different from a light rain, not just more heavier, denser, occupying space in a way that made the air feel pressurized. I looked up. Through the plexine I could make out the shapes of the honor guard. Even blurred by the translucent panel, they were unmistakable. The height, the shoulder silhouette of armor, the way they moved in formation. 12 of them, coming down 7D in a tight 2x2 column with 4 flanking in modified diamond formation. And ahead of them, at the far end of the corridor, a single human shape moving slowly back and forth with the steady, unhurried rhythm of someone mopping a floor. My first thought was, oh no. My second thought was, I should do something. My third thought, and this is embarrassing but honest, was, but what exactly would I do? I did not do anything immediately. I pushed back from my desk and I stayed very still and I watched. The honor guard stopped. This itself was unusual, I would learn later. The honor guard does not stop for obstacles. They route around obstacles, or obstacles route around them, because the safety of the dignitary they are escorting takes precedence over essentially everything. A blocked corridor is a tactical concern. A tactical concern gets resolved, quickly and without discussion. The lead guard, a warrior I would later learn was designated VTHRAC Commander Koss, held up one of her upper appendages in the halt signal. The formation stopped, precise, silent. She was looking at Milo Kastek's back. Milo Kastek was mopping. Koss said something. I couldn't hear it through the plexine, or rather, I could hear the sound of the language, which at that distance through the material registered as a low, clipped resonance, the kind the Kelthari language makes when it's being spoken at command register. Firm, carrying, the kind of voice you use when you are accustomed to being obeyed. Milo Kastek continued mopping. What I found out later from Milo himself when I asked him about it, and I did ask him, because this is the kind of thing you ask, was that he had his audio feed up high enough that he didn't hear Koss at all. He was listening to something he described when I asked, as old music, nothing special, just something I've had for years. He didn't specify and I didn't press. He was also, he said, at a section of the floor that required extra attention. There had been some kind of fluid spill in 7D earlier in the shift. He'd gotten the call about it on his maintenance comm, and the residue had dried partially and stuck to the floor, grating in a way that required slower, more deliberate work. He was focused on it. He was doing his job. He did not, he told me later with a kind of flat certainty that I found oddly impressive, see any particular reason to be hurrying. Koss spoke again, louder. Still nothing from Milo. I saw one of the other guards, a large male, rank insignia I couldn't make out at distance, step forward slightly from the formation. Testing, maybe, seeing if the human would react to the movement. Milo mopped. The guard stepped back. There was a pause then that I can only describe as a kind of collective recalibration. Like the 12 of them were processing a situation that their training had not specifically prepared them for. An obstacle that was not responding to the normal signals that obstacles respond to. Koss moved forward, alone, the rest of the formation held. She walked until she was approximately 3 meters behind Milo, which is well within the personal space threshold for most species, close enough to make her presence felt, close enough for even peripheral senses to register. And she said something again, louder than before, in Kelthari command register. Milo Kastek stopped mopping. Not because he heard her, because he had reached the edge of the section he'd been working and needed to reposition for the next pass. He turned around, pulling the mop with him, repositioning the bucket, and found himself looking at a 2.5-meter Kelthari warrior in full tactical ceremonial armor, standing 3 meters away from him with compound eyes and exoskeletal shoulder plating, and a rank insignia that anyone with half a cycle of interspecies familiarity would have recognized as extremely high. He looked at her. She looked at him. What happened next, Milo described to me like this. I figured they needed to get through, so I looked at the floor, the section I'd already done, and I looked at the section I was working, and I figured I could shift the bucket to the side and give them the cleaned section to walk on if they were careful. But the thing was, the section I hadn't gotten to yet was still wet on the near side from the original spill. And they're in armor, and I don't know what the traction profile of Kelthari armor plating is, but I know what happens when heavy things slip on a wet floor, so I couldn't just wave them through the wet part. He paused, and then he said, I needed to finish the section first, for their safety. And then he said, I tried to explain that. He did not speak Kelthari. Kas did not speak standard human common. What they had between them in terms of shared language was the outer veil trade pidgin, which both of them apparently spoke at a functional level, though Milo's version of it, by his own admission, was not great, but I can make myself understood if I go slow. So Milo Kastek, facing a Kelthari honor guard commander in full armor in a dimly lit sublevel corridor, proceeded to explain, in halting outer veil trade pidgin, that the floor was wet, that he needed approximately 8 more minutes to complete the section, and that if she would be willing to wait with her group at the near end of the corridor, he would have a safe path ready for them as quickly as he could work. I am told by Belvec, who had wandered over to stand beside me at the plexine wall by this point, his study materials forgotten, that the expression on Kas's face during this explanation was one he did not have a category for. It was not anger, Belvec told me later. It was not confusion exactly. It was more like, he paused, searching, like when you solve a calculation and the number you get is technically possible but you weren't expecting it. Kas did not respond immediately. She turned. She looked back at the formation. 11 Kelthari warriors stood in perfect, silent readiness. She turned back to Milo. Milo, for his part, had already turned back to the floor. He had taken out a different tool from his cart, a specialized scrubber for the dried residue sections, and was working with the focused efficiency of someone who has a job to do and is doing it. His audio buds were back in. Kas watched him for a moment. Then she did something that I have thought about many times since that night. She walked to the far side of the corridor, the cleaned section, the one Milo had indicated, and she stood there, waiting. And then, one by one, the 11 members of the honor guard moved up the corridor and arranged themselves on the cleaned section, out of the wet area, giving Milo Kastek room to work. 12 Kelthari honor guards, raised from childhood for combat, trained across decades in the arts of warfare and protection and tactical response. Standing quietly in a sublevel corridor, waiting for a human janitor to finish mopping the floor. I almost didn't believe it. Belvec made a sound next to me, a soft sound, the Torathi equivalent of surprise, and then went very quiet. It took Milo 9 minutes, not 8. He was thorough. He worked the scrubber into the dried residue sections with methodical patience, and when he was satisfied with a section, he moved on to the next, and he did not rush. Once during those 9 minutes, I saw Kas shift her weight, just slightly, the way someone does when they're standing still for long enough that the stillness becomes conscious effort. Milo didn't notice, he was working. At the 7-minute mark, one of the other guards, a younger one I thought based on the silhouette, though with Kelthari armor it's hard to tell, leaned toward the guard next to them and said something quietly. The second guard responded. Then a third made a short sound that I recognized even through the plexine as the Kelthari equivalent of laughter, not mocking, more like recognition of something absurd, not cruel, genuinely, briefly funny to them. Cass turned her head toward them. They straightened immediately. When Milo finished, he did the thing he always did at the end of a section. He stepped back, looked at the whole corridor from one end, tilted his head slightly, then went back to one corner and worked a little more at a spot that apparently wasn't quite right yet, then stepped back and looked again. Then he pulled the caution indicator from the near end of the corridor, moved it to the far end, because the far section was the one that was still damp, not the main body now, and he turned and said something to Cass in the trade pidgin. I couldn't make out the words, but the meaning was clear from the gesture that accompanied it. The corridor is ready. You can proceed. Cass looked at the floor, then at Milo. Then she said something back to him, in Kelthari, not trade pidgin. Command register again, and I want to be careful about this, because I am not a Kelthari linguist, and I only know what was later translated for me apparently in a register that carries a specific tonal marker that in Kelthari means something close to spoken to an equal. The translation came later, when the incident was formally documented and the dialogue was reconstructed. What Cass said to Milo Kastek, in the Kelthari language, using a register she apparently reserved for warriors of equivalent standing, was roughly, "Your section is clean, you worked it well." Milo Kastek nodded, the nod of someone who has received reasonable professional feedback about a completed task. He said in trade pidgin, "Watch the far end. Still damp." Then he pushed his cart toward the side corridor that led to his next section, and he disappeared around the corner. The 12 Kelthari honor guards proceeded through corridor 7D carefully, avoiding the far section that was still damp. I watched them go. When the last one had passed through and the corridor was quiet again, Belvik turned to me and said, in the most baffled voice I had ever heard from him, "What just happened?" I told him I wasn't entirely sure. We both stood there for another minute, looking at the empty corridor and the wet floor and the yellow caution sign at the far end. Part 2, what the records say and don't say. Here is the thing about incidents that happen in sublevel corridors of transit stations on overnight shifts. They are not usually the kind of incidents that get formally documented. What gets formally documented is violence, security breaches, contraband, species relations incidents that require arbitration, the large, dramatic moments that the station's reporting infrastructure is designed to capture. A human janitor making 12 elite warriors wait while he mopped a floor is not, technically, any of those things. There was no violence, there was no breach, there was no formal complaint, there was not even, as far as the official record was concerned for the first several days, an incident. It was Cass who filed the documentation. I only know this because 3 days after the event, I was called to the Bureau of Incident Documentation and asked to provide a witness account, and the reviewing archivist, a meticulous Dralesi named Huvex, told me, in his characteristically flat way, that the original report had been submitted by VTHRAC Commander Cass herself, and that she had classified it under the designation Species Behavioral Anomaly. Human, and that the report had already been escalated twice before it landed on Huvex's desk. Huvex was the one who told me what Cass had written. He read it to me verbatim from a translation. I'll give you the parts that mattered. KALTHRI, Diplomatic Guard Incident Report. Submitted by VTHRAC Commander Cass, 9th Order. Classification: Internal/Behavioral Observation. During transit through Station Helix 9, Sublevel 4, Corridor 7D, the escort formation encountered an obstacle: a human male performing sanitation duties in the transit corridor. Standard protocols were initiated. Verbal commands were issued. The human did not respond. After assessment, it became apparent that the human's non-response was not aggression, defiance, or tactical provocation. He had audio inserts in his hearing organs and was not receiving external stimuli. Upon contact, the human communicated, in trade pidgin, that the floor surface presented a safety hazard due to active moisture from a prior spill. He requested the formation hold position until the hazard was resolved. He cited the safety of the formation specifically, the risk of traction failure in armored equipment on wet flooring. I made the assessment that the human's concern was operationally valid. The floor section in question had visible moisture content, and the corridor's grading pattern presents a genuine traction risk under load-bearing armor. I directed the formation to hold position on the cleared section. The human completed the sanitation work. He was thorough. He corrected at least one section twice, apparently detecting residual contamination that his initial pass did not fully address. He worked without acknowledgement of the formation's presence and without apparent concern for rank or status. When the section was cleared, the human indicated safe passage and moved to his next work area without ceremony. This officer has encountered varied species in 14 cycles of active duty. In combat situations, in diplomatic contexts, in first contact environments. The behavioral profile of the human worker in Corridor 7D does not match any category in my working index. He did not show fear. He showed no submission posturing. He showed no aggression, dominance display, or territorial behavior. He showed, to the best of my interpretation, a complete preoccupation with the task he was performing and a genuine, pragmatic concern for the safety of those in his environment, regardless of what those individuals were. I am filing this report not because an incident occurred, but because I believe this behavioral profile warrants documentation. I have encountered warriors who did not fear death. I have not previously encountered a being who did not appear to register the concept of being intimidated. Note for record, this officer advised the formation to approach the far section of the corridor with care, as the human had indicated it was still damp. We did so. The floor was indeed still damp. The human's assessment was accurate. End of report. Huvex read the last line, and then looked at me over his reading apparatus. The human's assessment was accurate, he repeated, in a tone that I recognized as the Drelessy version of finding something genuinely remarkable. Yes, I said. He mopped the floor. Yes. And the commander of a Kelthari honor guard wrote a formal behavioral assessment report about it. Apparently. Huvex set down the document and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I have been an incident archivist for 22 cycles. I have documented first contacts, border incidents, diplomatic crises, 3 separate events classified as species-scale accidents, and one occasion where a malfunctioning bot declared itself a sovereign entity and refused to move for 11 days. I have never documented this. What specifically? I asked. A janitor, he said, making 12 warriors consider whether the floor was safe. My witness account was recorded. I told them what I saw through the plexine. I told them about the 9 minutes. I told them about the one guard who laughed, briefly, at something his companion said. Huvex flagged that specifically and asked me to describe it in more detail, which I did as best I could. I also told them about the way Milo had gone back to that one corner and worked it again, because he wasn't satisfied with it. Huvex made a note of that. He made the note slowly, like he was thinking while he wrote. He corrected his own work, Huvex said, without being asked, without anyone observing the correction except you through a translucent panel. Yes, because he noticed it wasn't right. That's my understanding. Huvex made another note. They interviewed Milo 3 days after I gave my statement. I know this because Milo mentioned it when I saw him in the corridor outside the documentation office. He was carrying his cart. He had his audio buds in. He pulled one out when he saw me, which I had come to understand was his version of a greeting. "They asked me about the other night," he said. "I know," I gave a statement. He nodded, not surprised, not particularly interested. "What did you tell them?" I asked. "What happened?" he said. "They kept asking if I was scared." "Were you?" He thought about this. He had a way of actually thinking before he answered, which I had noticed before, a pause that was genuine, not performative. He looked at the floor while he thought, which I had also noticed was a thing he did. "Of what?" he said finally. I opened my mouth and then closed it again. "The floor needed to be done," he said. "People were going to walk on it. Heavy armor on wet grading is," he shook his head slightly. "That's a bad fall. That's a serious injury situation. Didn't matter who they were." He put his audio bud back in. "They asked me if I knew who they were," he added, pulling it back out briefly. "I told them I figured they were somebody important. The armor was good quality, but I didn't know which somebody." He went back to work. Part 3. The things people said after. The incident report, once it cleared escalation and entered the public access record tier at the 14-cycle mark, moved through certain circles in a way that these things sometimes do. Not explosively, not overnight, but steadily, the way information moves when it touches something that multiple species find themselves wanting to turn over in their hands. What I mean is, people talked about it. Species who had regular diplomatic contact with the Kelthari talked about it, because Kelthari honor guards do not make behavioral assessment reports about sanitation workers. They do not. This is not a thing that happens. The fact that it happened, that Koss had filed the report not as a complaint, not as a security flag, but as a genuine observation worthy of record, this was itself unusual enough to make people pay attention. Species who had complicated relationships with humans talked about it for different reasons. There is a narrative that circulates in certain parts of the outer veil about humans, a narrative built partly on the historical record of Earth, partly on the behavior of humans in the early expansion years, partly on the fact that humans are, objectively, not physically remarkable by galactic standards. They are soft-bodied, no natural armor, limited sensory range, short-lived. The narrative goes that humans are interesting but essentially fragile, and that their reputation for stubbornness and creativity, and what some species translate as recklessness, is something that exists in extreme situations, in military contexts, in crisis moments. The narrative does not generally account for a 53-year-old janitor on a sublevel corridor in a transit hub making a judgment call about floor safety and then just following through on it, quietly, without drama, without anyone to perform for. I heard the discussion in several forms over the following months. Here are some of the ones I remember. A Grelin station engineer named Tovikt, one of the people who works on the power conduit that the maintenance bots like to cluster near, so I knew her slightly, stopped me in the corridor about a month after the incident had entered the public record. She had the report on a data tab. "I've read this 4 times, she said. "Okay. The thing I can't get past," she pointed at a section of the report. "He corrected the section twice. He went back." Yes. Nobody was watching him at that point. The guards were all on the clean section at the far end. "He didn't know I was watching through the panel," I said. "So he just did it." He said he noticed it wasn't right. Tovikt made a sound that is difficult to render in text, but that I can describe as the Grelin equivalent of, "I have encountered a concept I am still processing." She looked at the data tab again. "We have a phrase," she said. "Old Grelin, I'm not sure there's a good translation. It refers to the quality of doing precise work when you are alone, when no one could possibly know if you did it less precisely, and choosing precision anyway. What's it translate to roughly? She thought about it. Something like the honor in the work itself. She put the data tab away and walked on, and I stood there for a moment with that phrase. The honor in the work itself. The Kelthari response, when it eventually filtered through diplomatic channels, was more complex. What I learned from HFY, who had contacts in the Bureau of Species Relations, was that Kasa's report had been read by several senior members of the Kelthari Warrior Council, and that their response had been, collectively, something that translated as a form of respect that the Kelthari generally reserve for beings who have demonstrated competence under conditions that would unsettle others. The nuance HFY explained was this: the Kelthari do not respect courage for its own sake. Any creature can be brave out of desperation, or ignorance, or chemical response to threat. What they respect is what they call Verkan, roughly, correct action from settled self. The idea that a being does what it does not because it is reacting, not because it is afraid and overcomes the fear, not because it is calculating an advantage, but because it is simply in possession of itself and acts from that possession naturally. Kas had identified something in Milo Kastek that she filed as potentially Verkan. A janitor, HFY told me, with the air of someone who was still genuinely surprised by it. The Warrior Council is having a philosophical discussion about a janitor. He would find that extremely strange, I said. Has anyone told him? I mentioned it briefly. What did he say? I thought about it. What Milo had said when I told him that the Kelthari Warrior Council was apparently discussing his behavior in terms of a concept their culture reserves for exceptional warriors was, And then, the far section of 7D is still getting build-up near the grading seams. I've put in 3 requests for better solvent. Nobody's answered yet. And then he went back to work. There was a discussion. I don't know where it started, somewhere in the species relations academic community, I think, about what exactly had happened in terms of the power dynamic in that corridor. The 12 versus the 1. The trained versus the untrained. The armed and armored versus the man with a mop. The discussion, when I encountered versions of it, tended to go something like this. People expected the analysis to be about bravery, about one human standing down 12 warriors, about the David and Goliath shape of it. But the more I heard about it, the more I thought that framing was wrong, because Milo wasn't standing down anyone. He wasn't defying anyone. He wasn't making a statement about humans or about his own courage or about anything at all, really. He was mopping a floor. The confrontational element existed only in the perception of everyone else. To Milo, there was a wet floor, there were people who needed to cross it, and there was a job to do. Everything else was, from his perspective, beside the point. And I think that's what got under people's skin in a way that a more dramatic confrontation wouldn't have. Because if Milo had faced them down, had stared them down, had made some kind of stand, that would be comprehensible. That would fit into a story people knew. Brave individual, long odds, defiance, outcome. But he hadn't done that. He had done something that was, in a way, far stranger. He had simply not found the situation interesting enough to have a reaction to, not because he was suppressing a reaction, because, as best as anyone could tell, he genuinely didn't have one. He was busy.